Great. So today we have the pleasure of listening to Alyssa Battistoni, who's going to be discussing free gifts, capitalism, and the politics of nature. Alyssa Battistoni is an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College, where she works and teaches on climate and environmental politics, capitalism, Marxism, feminism, and other topics in contemporary social and political thought. She is the author of The Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature by Princeton, that was just out in 2025, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal by Verso 2019. We are really excited to have Alyssa on today. Alyssa, you have between 40 and 45 minutes for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am going to try one more time to share my screen. I think it probably won't work this time, just as it has in the past, like 10 times I've tried doing it. Teams says that it is sharing a window. I assume no one can see it. It says it is, so I think it's just not working for some reason. So, Katerina, I sent the slides to you. So, if you could just put them up. The first few are not that sort of significant anyway. They're just kind of illustrative. So, I'll just kind of I'll just get started.
Alyssa,
and wherever
sorry.
we
You
end up.
you send it with restricted access, so I don't have access to them. So you just need to, I just asked for access through the link that you gave me.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, just
That's
shared.
okay.
So hopefully that will work. So sorry for the technical difficulties. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to discuss the book with you. And also just wanted to say a sort of pre-apology. I'm getting over a cold, so I might be a little congested. But I'm gonna do my best to power through. Okay, so I'll just get started. In the endless expanse of the universe, every living thing we know of exists within a vertical band spanning a few hundred meters of a single planet, Earth. The space of life, sometimes termed the critical zone, is as large relative to the Earth as an apple's skin to its flesh. As small as it is, it nevertheless supports an astonishing array of life. Sea stars at the sunless bottom of the ocean, and vicuñas in the altiplano of the Andes, over 1,000 species of ant in the Amazon rainforest alone. Oh, great. If we can just go forward a couple. There's our critical zone. There's our many forms of life. And if we go a slide forward, or at least it has, because today many of the Earth's beings are in trouble. Catastrophic climate change is the most pressing ecological challenge we've now faced, but far from the only one. Vast forests have been felled for timber, marshlands converted to plantations. 1 million species presently stand at risk of extinction. And we can go ahead a slide again. And this is a crisis for everyone presently living on Earth. Millions of people around the world, including most indigenous peoples, rely directly on wild plants and animals for subsistence. Billions more rely indirectly on from wild insects to pollinate crops to marshes that filter water. And every single one of us relies on other beings to keep the planet habitable, from the microbes in the soil to plankton in the ocean. And this realization has prompted a reckoning in many quarters. We can go ahead a slide. In political discourse, it has become routine in recent years, almost to the point of cliche, to describe climate change as an existential threat. Scientists have proposed naming a new geological era, the Anthropocene, marked by the entrance of human activity into the fossil record. In economics, however, the astonishing transformations of our planet are frequently attributed to a surprisingly narrow cause, the absence of price. And fantastic slide movement, thank you. As the economist Nicholas Stern famously observed in his landmark report on the economics of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are externalities and represent the biggest market failure the world has seen. In other words, the effects of accumulating greenhouse gases are not factored into the prices of market goods, and as a result, are not taken into account in economic decisions. And this problem is most glaring with respect to carbon, but it's also much broader. The economist Pavan Sukhdev has argued that what he calls the economic invisibility of nature has serious consequences. It means that no one pays for the Amazon's rain factory, for example, or for insect pollination services. Although it's the likes of peat bugs and bees that keep life possible and bearable, Jonathan Guthrie notes in the Financial Times, we have not typically attributed any value to them, and this, he adds, seems like a mistake. The gap between these two discourses, the language of existential threat and that of economic error, is vertiginous. Is it really possible that this mistake could bring an end to life on Earth as we know it? And if so, why hasn't it been corrected? For if this is a mistake or a failure, it has proven enduringly difficult to rectify. The paradox of nature's non-value is a persistent one in political economic thought. Similar observations have been made for decades and even centuries. At the same time, it's perplexing to encounter claims that nature is endangered because it does not appear in the market. After all, capitalism is famously said to put a price on everything. It is notoriously merciless in its disregard for moral value, religious belief, and sentimental attachment. The realm of the market perpetually expands, stripping ever wider swaths of the world for parts. Markets regularly destroy the things that are bought and sold, such that everything precious must be protected from them, or at least so generations of critics have claimed. So if capitalism is characterized by relentless commodification, its continual failure to value many kinds of nature is puzzling. And this problem, I argue, is more profound than it has typically been acknowledged and deserves more careful critical attention than it's received. And that's what the book is about, the problem of the free gift of nature, more specifically about capitalism's persistent failure to value nature, and what it means for the politics of both nature and capitalism and the small matter of our collective future on the planet. So before I say more about the free gift, I want to just sort of address this other question: why look at capitalism to understand the politics of nature? And if politics is about how we make decisions about how to live together, nature is often seen to be outside of politics. Nature is what is and cannot be changed. But climate change has spurred a reevaluation of nature and politics for many people, but one that has pointed in two sort of contradictory directions. So on the one hand, climate change has seemed to mark what the environmental writer Bill McKibben famously described in 1989 as the end of nature. The human modification of the atmosphere itself means that there's no longer anything that stands apart from human beings. On the other hand, climate change seems to mark the return of autonomous nature, a material world which exists beyond our control. And for thinkers like Dipesh Chakrabarty, the climate crisis is about waking up to the rude shock of the planet's otherness. In either case, climate change is said to mark an unprecedented political challenge that requires us to rethink politics from the ground up. I argue by contrast that although climate change is transforming our planet in unexpected and unprecedented ways, it's not as politically unprecedented as we tend to imagine. Moreover, political theory is fundamentally about coming to terms with a world in flux, trying to make sense of emergent phenomena, processes, and institutions. And nature pertains to politics of all kinds, not only those we designate as environmental issues. Decisions about how to relate to other human beings are always inevitably decisions about how to relate to the more than human world around us. So at its land, we can find nature in all political theory. A key claim of the book, though, is that one of the densest sites of interaction between nature and politics is in the material realm we call the economy. It's in the economy that the matter given by nature is transformed into human artifacts, that wild flora become crops, fauna become livestock, minerals become resources, remnants of ancient life become fuel. And these transformations are structured crucially by a particular kind of economy, capitalism, which is now the political economic system upon which nearly all human beings now rely for our livelihoods, attend to our wants and needs. And we're used to thinking about capitalism as a particular way of organizing economic production and exchange, perhaps even of organizing social life writ large, as Nancy Fraser has argued. But capitalism is also what Jason Moore calls a way of organizing nature. In the course of constructing vast factories, capitalism has also reconstructed the biosphere. It is the dominant force remaking nature today. So if we're to understand the politics of nature, we have to understand how capitalism treats nature, both how it represents nature socially and makes use of it materially. So again, capitalism, the book argues, systematically treats nature as a free gift, something that can be taken without payment or replenishing, that's materially useful, but tends not to appear in exchange. And this is not, I argue, merely an accident or oversight, but rather foundational to how capitalism works, to its internal workings and social relations. So in the rest of the talk, I'll say a bit about the idea of the free gift and sort of the book's more other interventions. So there are three main interventions that the book makes. The first is to offer precisely a theory of the free gift as what I describe as a capitalist social form akin to the commodity, one that is characterized by usefulness lacking exchange value. The second is to follow the free gift into the world and sort of show what happens when these social relations hit the ground, literally to track the phenomena that result, the conceptual apparatuses developed to make sense of them, and the political struggles that have erupted around them. And the third is to offer a critique of capitalism's treatment of nature that's rooted not only in capitalism's environmental consequences, but what those consequences indicate about relationships amongst human beings and our ability to act freely in the world. So I'm going to focus mostly on the first here, but I'm happy to say more about 2 and 3 in the Q&A. So what is a free gift? I take the description of nature as a gift of production from the classical political economists who wrote in the 18th and 19th centuries, sort of describing the rise of capitalism, which was then transforming the modern world. And to these thinkers, the role of non-human elements in production was both evident and frequently remarked on, although often in passing. So nature, the physiocrat Turgot argued, makes a pure gift of production. David Ricardo lauds the abundance of natural agents that perform their work gratuitously. The French economist Jean-Baptiste Say provides some of the most extensive descriptions of what he calls natural agents. And for Say, natural agents are really ubiquitous in production. They include biological processes like the actions of organs and viscera that help produce wool in a flock of sheep, the vegetative power of the soil that generates crops, and the geophysical properties of the world like the wind that drives mills and sails. And to say it's simply obvious that nature plays an essential role in economic production in the way that someone like Bruno Latour might invoke the role of actants. And this is what makes him, I think, quite striking to read even today, because it's clear that human beings don't generate wealth alone. But if anything, it might be too obvious, because both classical political economists and a number of, I think, contemporary environmental thinkers who have tried to restore nature to economics tend to take the contributions of nature to production too much at face value. Because it's true, of course, that much of what we think of as wealth is produced by beings other than ourselves, but what we think of as wealth is not necessarily what capitalism designates as value. And this is why I argue we need Marx's critique of political economy to help us locate the free gift of nature more firmly within capitalism in particular. So here I want to say a brief word about how I use Marx because his ecological legacy is complicated. He's long been criticized by ecological thinkers as a Promethean modernist committed to the domination of nature. And more recently, he's been recovered by thinkers like John Bellamy Foster and Kohei Saito as a proto-ecological thinker concerned with problems like soil fertility and the metabolic rift. And this isn't what I'm doing. I'm not really interested in whether Marx was sort of really an environmental thinker or not. Instead of looking to him substantively or reading him exegetically, I draw on Marx methodologically. And I'm interested in how Marx confronts one of the core questions of ecological thought, the relationship between nature and society, while locating that question within capitalism as a particular form of social organization. And as I argue and try to show, the relationship between the natural and social is central to his overall analysis, which is often discussed in terms of content and form. So Marx argues that the classical political economists have essentially adopted a naive view of the material world. They've considered the material forms of existence, he says, apart from the social conditions in which they appear in capitalist production, and as a result, they've understood value to consist in material things, land, nature, and the various modifications. Nature, he argues in Volume 3 of Capital, is a free gift to capital alone. Capitalists alone have benefited from productivity gains enabled by the deployment of natural agents. They alone have laid claim to the resulting wealth. But he doesn't actually say that much more about the free gift. It's sort of this brief comment in a discussion of rent. A number of other eco-socialists and eco-Marxists have sort of referenced this term, but it's remarkably theorized. And yet it's quite a peculiar phrase when we think about it. Because on the one hand, it seems redundant. It's one of the defining features of gifts that they aren't bought and sold after all. And if we can move forward a slide. And in Western philosophy, the gift is often understood as a unidirectional expression of generosity, expressing something like pure altruism. And this is sort of one way of thinking about the gift. But another way of thinking of the gift is as fundamentally reciprocal. So true gifts, Robin Wall Kimmerer argues, are not free. They incur obligations and must be returned. Gifts are a kind of relationship that incur ongoing social relationships that require some kind of reciprocity. So the gift seems to be either, again, redundant or oxymoronic. And while these different understandings of the gift point in different directions, in both gifts are typically treated as outside of the logic of commodity exchange altogether, and sometimes seen as offering an alternative to capitalism and capitalist social relations organized around the commodity. The free gift of nature, by contrast, is neither kind of gift, and it's not an alternative to capitalism at all. So the modifier free, I think, is telling. It provides a clue that the free gift is a category defined in relation to the market. The free gift of nature is free in the sense of costless or gratuitous. It denotes that something is priced as zero. And this becomes significant in a world where most things have a price. So natural agents become free gifts only within capitalist social relations, in situations of generalized commodity exchange and market dependence, in which most human labor is sold for a wage, and production is oriented not towards the generation of use values, but the accumulation of abstract values. It's only where most things have a price does it even make sense to describe nature's gifts as free. So this is why I argue the free gift is a distinctively capitalist social form, akin to concepts like the commodity. It's how nature appears in capitalist societies. And to understand it a bit better, we have to bring the question often posed in environmental thought, what is nature, together with one posed by Marx, which is sort of what is value under capitalism. And this, again, is sort of one of the major critiques and challenges that Marx poses to the classical political economists. He says political economy has indeed analyzed value, but it has never once asked the question of why this content assumes that particular form. They've purported to study the meaning and source of economic value and wealth, but they haven't really asked what value is or what is specific about capitalism's definition of it. And capital begins, of course, with an analysis of the commodity as capitalism's elementary social form, the form in which the wealth of capitalist societies appears. The commodity, Marx argues, is defined by its dual character. It has both material content and social form, or alternatively, both natural form and value form, corresponding to use and exchange value. So as human beings, we see things in their natural form. We see a wooden table, for example, as an ordinary, sensuous thing. We might notice the type of wood or the pattern of the grain or appreciate its use for a dinner party. And in this form, Marx says there's nothing mysterious about it. It's in its appearance in the social form of the commodity when its value is expressed in the abstract quantitative form of exchange value that it becomes peculiar, that it requires investigation. Here we see that the table's usefulness isn't directly equivalent to its value. And for Marx, all capitalist social forms have this dual character. They exist in something like the real world of sort of physical appearance, but also in capitalism's particular social reality. Marx tends to understand nature as having mere use value and hence being sort of irrelevant to the critique of political economy. It's not entering into this mysterious world of exchange. It doesn't need to be investigated. But I think we need to look more closely at these sorts of qualities. The persistence of things with use value that doesn't tend to appear in the form of exchange value should push us to ask how, in constituting some things as having value, capitalism constitutes others as lacking it. Because things that aren't commodified do not thereby escape the overarching logic of commodity exchange. Their status in the structure of a society organized commodity exchange in the market changes. They're devalued in relation to commodities, often with significant consequences. So in my view, we should read the free gift of nature as having a dual character akin to that of commodity, to understand it as a social form characterized by material qualities that don't appear in the form of value. And Marx is particularly interested in the status of human labor under capitalism, why he asks are so many different human activities classified as sort of the simple category labor and recognized insofar as they produce value. Why is labor organized as it is, and how might it be organized differently? But posing this question, why human labor is expressed in form of value, Marx implicitly poses another, which is why non-human nature is not. So the book applies Marx's question to nature, asking why does such an enormously wide range of content, material capacities ranging from soil fertility to animal digestion, tend to take the same form, the free gift of nature? Why does capitalism seem to draw such a stark distinction between human labor and other elements of production? So one obvious place to begin is with Marx's own most famous statement about the difference between human and non-human labor, in which he compares the worst of architects to the best of bees. And here we have a beehive with the absolutely hideous, I can't remember what it's called now, but the structure and the Hudson Yards development here in New York, which is really awful. Marx recognizes that other kinds of beings engage in activities that resemble those of human beings. Each change the materials of nature to sustain their own forms of life. The bee, like the architect, builds a home, the spider, like the weaver, constructs a web, and so on. But what truly distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees, Marx famously says, is the purposive intent that directs human transformations of nature. He says man not only affects the change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purpose in those materials. So only human beings labor consciously, only they intentionally make the world in their own image. And this has led many to conclude, sort of evidence towards the conclusion that Marx is simply an anthropocentric figure. And that might well be true, but importantly, the fable of the architect and the bee is not an account of what makes human labor valuable under capitalism specifically. It's not an account of sort of distinctively capitalist labor processes. Instead, it's a more historical account of the labor process and of what makes the activity of human beings in general distinct from that of other kinds of beings that engage in nominally similar activities. And I think we might want to contest the accuracy of this portrait of non-humans. Marx suggests that non-human consciousness is basically non-existence, while a large body of scientific research suggests otherwise. But we shouldn't confuse this account of human distinction per se with his account of how and why human labor becomes significant in the production of capital's value. In fact, there's no obvious link between his account of human labor as conscious and purposive and the status of human labor and the capitalist labor process. Workers on the assembly line are hardly consciously transforming the world according to their will, as in Marx's vision of the bee and the architect. Their activity is being directed by someone else, the owner of the factory, as we see when he explores the valorization process, which I won't go into here. But the key point I want to argue is that instead of reading Marx as an anthropocentric figure, even though I think he probably was, I argue that capitalism is a humanism, and Marx's focus on human labor is a product of his critique of political economy and his attempt to investigate capitalism's operation. So what I try to do here is to develop a very minimal concept of the human being and human capacities that can help us understand how capitalism draws on and elevates these capacities. This isn't an argument about the exceptional or superior qualities of human beings per se. It's an attempt to offer an account of distinction without hierarchy. So the nature's lack of value, I argue, is not the result of how capitalism has transformed our views of nature, as is often claimed, that we sort of changed our cultural orientation or worldview to devalue and degrade nature, but rather downstream of capitalism's transformation of social relations amongst human beings. In particular, the rise of a class division amongst human beings, which forces some people to sell their labor power to others, also gives rise to a new relationship between human beings and the natural world. And two capacities rooted in distinctively human forms of consciousness, the indeterminacy of human labor and the ability to exchange time for a wage, become inordinately important within capitalist societies. They heighten the distinction between human beings and non-human nature. So I'll say a word about each in brief. So the first is the sort of organization of human beings in a class society. And so Marx emphasizes, of course, that class society itself is not natural, but there's something about the natural form of human beings, or we might think of sort of the qualities of human beings, that seems to make it possible. So the division of society into classes of owners and workers is thinkable only for human beings, insofar as humans are reliant on tools that can be separated from their persons, such that one person can control the means of another's survival. And under these conditions, what is significant about that human purposive capacity to imagine and plan production in advance is the ability to separate the design and execution of labor. So some people design and others execute, as Harry Braverman and others have observed. What Braverman describes as the indeterminacy of human labor, moreover, means that human laborers can do a wide variety of tasks, and this is also a distinctive feature of human consciousness. So when you use natural agents in production, their capacities are generally limited. The spider can weave a web but can't push a plow. A human laborer, by contrast, can work at a loom or in a field. And this in turn means that human labor can be conceived as a general abstract category, abstract and interchangeable. This distinction is also key to elements of class struggle within capitalist production. So the capitalist has to compel the laborer to do the assigned task and do it in a way that maximizes value. There's a constant struggle over how much labor the capitalist can squeeze out of a discrete period of time. The second key element is the consciousness that makes possible the wage relation, in other words, which makes it possible for human beings to distinguish their labor power, their ability to labor from themselves, and to sell a discrete quantity of that labor power measured in units of time for an abstract quantity of money, the wage. And this is important because when human labor becomes wage labor, when that's the general way that human labor is acquired, natural agents come to appear as wage labor's opposite, as constitutively wageless. And I call this the anthropocentrism of the wage, following the Marxist feminist Sylvia Federici's account of the patriarchy of the wage with respect to unwaged reproductive labor. And because non-humans can't receive a wage, they can't engage in the kinds of social interactions that structure capitalist social interactions, and that indeed structure a great deal of social life in capitalist societies. They can't express their preferences in the market and acquire the things they need to survive. An orangutan can't outbid palm oil producers to preserve the Indonesian rainforest as a home rather than a plantation, for instance. So non-humans can appear in the system only where they are owned by human beings as property for which rents are charged, payment is made to other human beings, which of course do not reward the non-humans themselves. So at this point, I want to emphasize the distinction between the social form of the free gift and literal freeness. So some gifts of nature do have a price where they're monopolized by human owners, but many do not. And there's more to say about these points, but the key point I want to emphasize here is that capitalism's measure of value reflects human action and interest alone. So I'm going to, in my remaining time, just say a bit more about the other two book interventions book makes. So the second, this has been kind of a pretty high level of abstraction, engaged in some of these more Marxological debates, but most of the book also considers a sort of concrete phenomena and problems that have arisen from this basic paradox of usefulness without value or sort of material effect without value, and how that basic paradox has been conceived in social and political thought. So 4 essential chapters address different iterations of the free gift. So you look at machinery and human cooperation within sites of production, the sort of classic hidden abode of production. I then turn to consider the sort of realm of the things that emanate from that realm of production, look at pollution and the sort of byproducts of production, often described in terms of social cost or externality in the realm of what we often describe as the environment. I consider the why certain kinds of human labor seem to appear as free gifts, looking at unwaged labor in so-called reproductive labor in the household, and considering Marxist feminist traditions that have investigated that form of labor. and then turn to consider the various kinds of ecological activity that are often described as natural capital or ecosystem services operating in the biosphere, keeping the planet habitable. And these chapters are more historical. They address the period now understood as a great acceleration, the period since roughly 1950, which has seen the rapid increase of human activity of various kinds paired with corresponding biospheric decline. And nearly all of contemporary political thought has developed in this period, as well as most modern environmental thought. So each of these chapters traces how political scientists, economists, philosophers, activists, and others have responded to these biospheric transformations in both thought and action, including in work that doesn't seem immediately ecological. So here I look at a pretty wide range of thinkers, from people like Arthur Pigou and Ronald Coase on the externality and social cost, to Silvia Federici and William Baumol on domestic labor and service work. And in these chapters, I try to show, on the one hand, how an analysis of capitalism can give us new perspective on contemporary ecological problems and familiar policies, from carbon taxes to biodiversity markets. I try to read many contemporary economists as Marx reads classical political economists, recognizing the real phenomena they track and arguing that they are describing something important about how capitalism works on the surface, but arguing that we also need to sort of investigate those at a deeper level. But I also argue that the free gift casts capitalism itself in new light. And the free gift is, I see as something like the commodity shadow, and following it, I think, can take us into dimensions of capitalism often left underexplored. It draws our view to underattended aspects of capitalism. It calls attention to the remainders, to things that are left over when capitalism has commodified what it can. It serves as a reminder that capitalism may be operative even where its telltale signs, exchange value wages, and so on, are not immediately in evidence. So a key argument of the book overall is that capitalism, we have this view of capitalism as constantly commodifying more and more of the world, bringing more and more of the world into the orbit of price. But a key argument of the book is that capital does not just advance and absorb, it also withdraws and expels, abdicates, and neglects. I look to the sort of not only the abstract dimensions of capitalist value, but to the often underattended elements of use value, the qualitative elements of the world. Because although the free gifts of nature tend to be invisible to capital, they continue to exist in the physical world as natural form. They continue to have material effects in both concrete production processes and in the world writ large, for better and worse. So I try to hold these two aspects of the dual form together. I consider how the qualities of different kinds of nature factor into particular labor processes, how they inform capital's valorization process and the organization of labor. And I look at the effects in the world more broadly, at the harmful effects of matter that isn't valued, like carbon emissions, again, often discussed in terms of things like social costs. So the third and final intervention is to offer a critique of capitalism rooted not in ecological effects, but an account of human freedom. So one of the interventions here is simply a sort of denaturalizing one. To diagnose the free gift as a distinctively capitalist social form is to state that this isn't a necessary relationship to nature and to make it a political question. This is not the only way we could treat the non-human world. There are other ways we might do so. But this alone doesn't tell us what, if anything, is wrong with treating nature as a free gift. And here, I think the grounds for an ecological critique of capitalism typically seem obvious. Capitalism has long been shadowed by charges that its satanic mills have ravaged the natural world, while its calculative logic has disenchanted it. Nature has often been embraced as a wholesome antidote to capitalist artificiality and alienation. Environmental philosophy has tended to focus on our ethical obligations to the natural world, to non-human beings, the question of nature's intrinsic value, and so on. And I am sympathetic to and share many of these concerns and critiques, but the problem, I think, is that many of them take the normative status of nature itself for granted. They hold up nature as a standard against which we can measure human society. But this, I think, is a difficult position to hold when we take on board critical perspectives on nature itself. When we recognize that human societies have shaped nature and vice versa, that the natural world is in a constant state of flux, so that there's no obvious baseline against which we can measure, that our perceptions and cultural views of what nature is are always culturally and historically specific. In other words, we can't just say it's bad to transform nature. We need to be able to assess which transformations of nature are harmful, problematic, to be condemned. And that means, I think, that we need to understand the causes of effects we find troubling. And this is why I argue that capitalism constrains our ability, both individually and collectively, to make genuine decisions about how to value and relate to the non-human world and to take responsibility for those decisions. It limits our ability to treat non-human nature as something other than a free gift. And I draw an unusual source, the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, to make this claim, which I won't say more about here, but again, happy to discuss in Q&A. But I make sort of two arguments about seeing capitalism as a form of rule with two core dimensions. So first is what I discuss as class rule, the constitutive power, division of social power amongst human beings, rooted in disparate control over productive assets, and the curious form of the rule of the few that results, where a small number of people control most decisions about production, and thus decisions about the production, not only of sort of commodities and goods, but also about the environment and indeed the conditions of our planet. But I also discuss what I call market rule, how decisions and actions are structured in societies centered around market exchange. I show how we're all compelled by interaction in and competition in the market to act in ways that may go against our better judgment, how markets separate our intentions and consequences in ways that make us extremely difficult for us to be responsible for what we do or take responsibility for the world we've made. And this is a process that some thinkers have described as something like abstract or social domination or mute compulsion, but I try to address at a more granular level, drawing in particular on Sartre's concept of seriality. And so here I try to challenge the argument, as made famous by Milton Friedman, that capitalism is simply about being free to choose, showing that it in fact undermines our ability to do so. I don't make a positive argument about how we ought to value nature otherwise, and in my view, many ethical debates about how nature ought to be valued are important and necessary, but also effectively debates about a post-capitalist world. They're concerned with qualities like cultural meaning and ecocentric significance that simply aren't priorities in a world governed by private investment and accumulation. So instead, I try to tease out latent values and judgments that pose challenges to capitalist valuation, even where they're not articulated as such. And I do think that the free gift can help us question capitalism's particular form of value. The capitalist value, as I've suggested, does not necessarily reflect social wealth, and this is true in general for commodities that are bought and sold, as well as for the free gifts of nature, which aren't. But we're used to evaluating the worth of commodities in exchange and accepting the judgment of the market as a measure of worth. When something's in price, however, we're left without a measure of how we're supposed to assess it. We have to think for ourselves about what it should be, what it's worth. And I think it's precisely because the free gift of nature fails to appear in the form of price that it can act as a wedge into the broader structure of capitalist valuation. The extremity of the disjuncture between what nature's value should be and what it is presents a particularly acute portrait of capitalism's general mismeasurement of wealth. It poses a stark question. If the planetary processes that constitute the bases of life on Earth aren't valued at all, why would we accept capitalism to value anything else as we think it should? Thanks very much. I will end it there and look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'm just going to stop recording.